I don't know about you, but I'm pretty tired of people saying that Russia can't lose the war in Ukraine. Of course they can. They're not superhuman, and war is unpredictable. In fact, Russia has lost wars in recent history against smaller, less advanced forces than they're going up against right now in Ukraine. So today we're going to look at some recent wars where Russia or the Soviet Union was defeated to give us an idea of what could be in store as they continue their invasion of Ukraine. Now, people really like to focus on World War II, where, of course, it wasn't just the Russians fighting, but all of the Soviet Union. Instead, today we're going to take a look at more recent military campaigns that might give us an idea as to how and when the Russian state could break. Now, I want to be clear. This isn't my saying that Russia is on the verge of collapse or that their military is about to be defeated in Ukraine. Instead, this video is designed to look at past examples that may help us understand what could be in store going forward. The ongoing war in Ukraine has had a few kind of key distinguishable phases. For the first few days, most of the world thought that Russia was unbeatable and that they would simply roll over Ukraine in a matter of weeks. Next came the phase that I'd say was largely in the fall of 2022 to summer of 2023, where it appeared that Russia could actually lose this war. They'd been kicked out of Kharkiv, Ukraine retook Kherson, drones left the Black Sea Fleet scared of leaving port, and a major offensive was in the works to liberate even more Ukrainian territory. Then, after the conclusion of the 2023 Ukrainian offensive that made, at most, some pretty modest gains in the south, it began to look again like Russia couldn't be defeated. At least not by Ukraine in the way the war is being waged today. And that's the phase we're in right now, a phase of wondering if Russia can actually be beat. Today I'm going to break all of this down into three portions. First, a look at the Russian leadership, or Vladimir Putin. Second, the situation on the home front. And third, conditions on the battlefield. Starting with Putin, Dr. Ben Conable of Georgetown University recently published an article titled "Russians Do Break: Historical and Cultural Context for a Prospective Ukrainian Victory," where he writes, quote, "On the home front, Russian President Vladimir Putin appears implacable as ever. Since 2022, hundreds of thousands of Russian men have volunteered or dutifully reported for service in waves, feeding what now looks even to the Russian public to be a meat grinder offensive in the eastern Donbass region of Ukraine. 2 years into a war that has buckled their economy, killed or wounded perhaps over 300,000 servicemen, and produced many notable battlefield defeats, civilian willingness to back Putin's war appears, at least on the surface, to be unwavering. Keeping in mind the poor conditions for survey work in Russia, Levada Center polling showed 77% support for the war in the beginning of 2024. End quote. That all sounds about right. I mean, there doesn't appear to be any indication that Putin, the Russian people, or the Russian army are on the brink of collapse. I know those crazy predictions online tend to get a lot of attention. You know the ones. They've kind of turned into running jokes at this point. That's something Conable actually hit on, saying, quote, "Given the assumption that Russians have an inexhaustible willingness to fight, public discussions of the war in Ukraine have focused on other questions. Will the Russians run out of Soviet-era war stocks? Will their economy collapse? Will Ukraine's Kursk incursion succeed or backfire? How many casualties can the Russians sustain, or will they overthrow Putin? This all has devolved into a flailing roller coaster ride of excited prospects and dashed hopes, and then inevitably to exhausted patience." End quote. So I am 100% on board there. Unfortunately, we've seen some cheerleaders in this and other conflicts that tend to conflate belief in a cause with hope and conditions on the ground and future prospects. Personal opinion, but I don't think that approach is helpful. And honestly, I think it's part of what caused a bit of a backlash in the United States to our continued providing of aid to Ukraine. Our government was really hyping up the Russian losses, challenges to the Russian economy, and Ukrainian battlefield gains where, to an average citizen just tuning in from time to time, they could have the idea that the war was almost over back in early 2023. But it wasn't. Not even close. So then when more requests came out for aid, I do think there were a lot of people wondering why this war, that sounded like Russia was clearly losing, was still going on. I can understand how some folks felt deceived. The cheerleading doesn't help, and I think in a lot of cases, it actually does pretty significant damage. Now, shifting over to the home front, it's worth thinking about the Russian people's ability to endure suffering. Conable says, quote, "Perceptions of trauma are visible as a deep current in Russian shared history. They're also anchored in a singular modern event, the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union. Many Russians believe theirs is a nation of eternal and passive sufferers, and of course, there are grounds for this belief. Despite the state's increasingly vast access to resources from the 19th through the 21st centuries, average citizens of Russia and the Soviet Union lived in a general state of poverty and powerlessness. End quote. So when the idea comes up that the people may revolt or the economy is so bad that the Russians will demand change, we have to remember who we're talking about. Konoval added, quote, rural and small-town Russians and many less well-off urban Russians are long accustomed to being manipulated and abused, really traumatized, by state officials at all levels. Their general expectations for an equitable and hopeful life are, to be fair, broadly tempered, end quote. Then, of course, we have to talk about the Russian military on the battlefield. Just about every comparison I see harkens back to the Red Army of World War II to discuss not only their victories, but the cost in lives they were willing to spend to achieve them. Or, put another way, sacrifice. Konoval says, quote, themes of unquestioning sacrifice are central to this anchored collective remembrance of the Great Patriotic War. Probably over 25 million Russian soldiers and civilians died in World War II. Russians have long perceived this sacrifice as an absolute necessity. Westerners might view Russians' fond remembrance of such an enormous loss as perverse, but for many Russians, the losses themselves are an almost unquestioned point of pride. He continues, quote, Russian victory typically emerged only following extensive trauma, say after a costly Mongol, Polish, or German invasion. Cultural memory of the Great Patriotic War organizes and front-loads this powerful narrative of nationalist sacrifice. So when the invasion of Ukraine is likened to a little patriotic war, or in any way compared to World War II, then collective defensive nationalist sacrifice is firmly established as an expectation for victory. End quote. Look, there's a reason the Russian people and their military are considered difficult to defeat. History shows they're willing to stay in the fight much longer than anyone anticipates, but that has not always been the case. There are plenty of examples throughout history where Russia has been defeated, so let's turn to a few of their more recent losses. And as I run through these, think if anything sounds familiar to what's happening in Ukraine right now. But first, a quick thank you to the sponsor of today's video, HelloFresh. Look, I know you're busy, I'm busy, we're all busy, but that doesn't mean you have to eat junk or settle for the same boring thing day after day. HelloFresh can be a great option when life gets busy, or if you're like me and your plans are constantly changing, so it's hard to plan ahead. HelloFresh lets you customize your delivery from week to week, and everything can be tailored to your schedule by adjusting your delivery date, or even skipping a week if you won't be home to cook. And if I can put it together, then so can you. Here's a look at one of the meals I made for my family this past week. All right, welcome to the Stewart Kitchen. So I'm on cooking duty tonight, and we're going to be putting together this sesame soy beef bowl from HelloFresh. Let's go ahead and take a look at the before and see how close we can get my work to look like this. Of course, HelloFresh sent over all of the ingredients that we need for this recipe, broken out individually. And on the back of this card, we've got the recipe. Let's give it a shot. All right, so we're done. Not bad, I feel. About 30 minutes worth of work. So click the link in the description or use my code to get 10 free meals plus free breakfast for life. One breakfast item per box while subscription is active if you're in the United States. Outside the U.S., local discount will apply. Now we're going to start with the Soviet Union's defeat in Afghanistan during the war there from 1979 to 1989. On the home front, the Soviet economy was being strained. It was already facing difficulties, and the increased cost of military expenditure forced the government to divert funding from domestic programs that quickly fell by the wayside. Things like healthcare, education, and infrastructure all suffered so the army could continue to fight. The soldiers returning home, dead or alive, also caused a pretty significant stir. Around 15,000 Soviet soldiers were killed in Afghanistan, so far fewer than Ukraine, but still the government tried to cover up the scale of the casualties. As more wounded soldiers returned home and countless families had no idea the fate of their loved ones, discontent grew as many questioned the value of the ongoing conflict and what exactly was set to be achieved. Within the Soviet military, morale plummeted as the vaunted Red Army found itself taking heavier casualties from a lesser equipped but highly motivated force in the Mujahideen. This wasn't the easy war that some thought it would be, and as losses increased, corruption and drug use mounted, further eroding any prior discipline within the force. These combinations of military, domestic, and economic challenges would eventually lead to the Soviet decision to withdraw from Afghanistan in 1989. Now, that was technically the Soviet Union, and we're talking about Russia today, so let's move forward a bit in time to the Russian defeat in the First Chechen War from 1994 to 1996. Again, the Russian army underestimated their adversary, going in thinking the war would be quick and easy, but running up against a determined Chechen people who were committed to maintaining their independence. The military also wasn't ready for the logistical burden required to fight this war. Russian soldiers quickly found themselves short of supplies without radios or even basic necessities like food and water. And of course, in any military, this destroys morale and significantly reduces a force's ability and will to fight. Additionally, the Russian army was full of corruption. Most soldiers were poorly trained and underpaid, and Russia was forced to rely heavily on conscripts who were overall unmotivated and not overly willing to fight and die for their country. The Russian military's heavy-handed tactics, including indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, drew widespread international condemnation. Human rights organizations criticized Russia for committing atrocities and war crimes in Chechnya, putting pressure on the Russian government both diplomatically and economically. And although Russia didn't face direct military intervention from Western powers, it did face diplomatic isolation and criticism, particularly from European nations and the United States. All of this and more led to Russia negotiating a ceasefire in 1996 that granted Chechnya de facto independence and leading to the eventual withdrawal of Russian forces. So Russia can be defeated. They have been defeated. Now let's take a look at how that might play out in Ukraine. By looking at historical examples and seeing what still resonates today, it's worth noting that Russia's largest vulnerability is likely a mix between battlefield losses and economic strain. Starting on the battlefield, we know losses are high, although the exact number is debated. Even going well below the low-end estimate, we know more Russian soldiers have been killed in Ukraine than Soviets in the 10-year war in Afghanistan, so it is pretty significant. Yes, they appear to be able to handle that so far, but every nation, including Russia, has a breaking point. We can already see that Russian leaders are keyed into some of these issues and have been trying to head them off since the very early days of the war. I mean, take the casualty reporting. The Kremlin has kept that a state secret from the opening of the invasion of Ukraine. There have been a few investigations trying to uncover total losses, but there's a lot of speculation needed because the reporting on the subject inside of Russia, the notification of families, or even funeral arrangements for military personnel are spotty at best and more accurately described as intentionally vague. That's a real trade-off a country has to make in war. You don't want the enemy to know your exact losses, but keeping that from the soldiers' families and loved ones can lead to serious domestic consequences. On the home front, the Russian economy has faced significant challenges due to the war, but it's also shown unexpected resilience in certain areas. Western sanctions initially caused a pretty sharp decline in exports and a fall in the ruble's value. However, Russia has adapted by redirecting trade towards non-Western markets, especially in Asia, and benefiting from high global oil prices. Despite these adaptations, the economy is increasingly dependent on wartime spending, with defense making up over 30% of the national budget. Inflation and a budget deficit persist, while long-term growth prospects are hampered by sanctions and isolation from Western technologies. We're also seeing a direct impact of state spending going to defense rather than other sectors. According to a recent article in Foreign Affairs, they say that in its 2023 budget, the Kremlin cut spending on medical services by 23%. That's huge. On social media, people complained of long wait times for basic medical services caused by staff shortages, equipment like ventilators being out of order, and a lack of vaccines and chemotherapy. Just like the soldiers and the citizens, Putin, too, has a breaking point. Turning back to Conable, who said, quote, "While he presently retains dominant control over the state and enjoys at least an imposed version of popular support, Putin is aging and may be weakening. His surprisingly passive and initially incoherent response to Yevgeny Prigozhin's revolt in 2023 caused a re-examination of his carefully constructed aura of invulnerability. Putin's equally lethargic response to Ukraine's 2024 Kursk incursion and his increasingly fantastical claims about Russia's economy reinforce perceptions that he may be hurting." End quote. All right, so a few things we need to keep an eye on here in the coming months. First, I do think the Ukrainian invasion into Kursk is notable. That's Ukrainian forces that continue to occupy Russian territory. It's playing a big role in Russian media, and the response has been lackluster at best. It's a hard one for Putin to explain away the longer it goes on. Another is a question of manpower. Normally, folks are looking exclusively at the soldiers dying at the front and asking how Russia will replace them. Then they do, over and over again. I'm talking a little more big picture here. So according to the Conflict Intelligence Team, or CIT, they say, quote, "There was a difficult period in the first half of 2024 when the trickle of recruits was too slow to make up for losses and create new units. However, the issue appears to have been resolved by raising bonus payments. We saw an increase in the number of recruits in the second quarter and in the third quarter. There was another pay raise, probably resulting in another increase. Whether it will help in the long term remains to be seen. The issue may need to be revisited closer to the end of the year. Until then, the situation is unlikely to become threatening," end quote. So Russia is filling their ranks, but it's costing them more and more every quarter. This, of course, raises the question of when or if a new wave of mobilization may be needed. According to military analyst Yan Mativ, quote, the main obstacle for new waves of mobilization is the lack of candidates. The authorities are grabbing everyone willing to go to war for money. Meanwhile, forcing people to take up arms for free will be a much greater challenge. He says for free, essentially he means they're being conscripted into the force instead of making the decision to take the bonus payment to go and fight. He says this is where law enforcement agencies may turn out to be short of the capabilities to make sure everything goes quickly and smoothly. We may see raids, conflicts, and protests across the country. End quote. That's the suggestion that a mobilization could result in an uprising like we haven't yet seen, that the increased pay is masking the public discontent with the war, and the moment it's forced upon more people, the population could break. There's another piece here, too. The Russian economy needs more workers, especially to help keep the ongoing pace of military spending. However, they also need more men in uniform. Of course, this isn't just a matter of running out of people entirely. It's running out of those willing to do the work without causing any issues. For the military, think of those from the poorest regions or maybe even convicts. For the workforce, it has to be able-bodied workers, higher in status, if you will, than those being conscripted, but not able to take on a more lucrative job elsewhere. You can see Russia is really at risk at straining their military-aged male population, even if you extend that up to age 45 or 50. Conflict intelligence team hit on this recently as well, saying, quote, companies are hiring people off the street to use them to meet their military recruitment targets while preserving their staff. As harsh as it may sound, an unemployed man with a bank loan and the last combine harvester operator in a village have different value for business and therefore for the economy. Since mobilization is a lottery, the probability of losing a skilled professional is much higher. Additionally, replacing 30,000 employees a month is not quite the same as 300,000. Reduction in available manpower in either of these areas, military or the workforce, could have a near immediate impact on the course of the war, which may be one of the reasons we're seeing more and more speculation and kind of early reporting about North Korea providing soldiers and personnel, maybe for some of these, rear area tasks and possibly even at some point being moved towards the front. And the last item here is inflation. Economics are, of course, a little out of my wheelhouse and not something I often hit on, but it's also an unavoidable aspect of this and really any war. As wartime spending continues to grow while sanctions are in place and expanding, there's a real risk of significant inflation in Russia. Add to this the weakening ruble and what we'll call labor challenges. I don't think shortages are the term quite yet, but they might be close, and you have an economy that has a lot of potential weak points. Again, it's not really one of those items that could lead to Putin and Russia deciding to end the war on unfavorable terms. However, if two or more of these battlefield and economic issues culminate around the same time, it could very well lead to a repeat of what we saw with the Soviets in Afghanistan or the Russians in Chechnya. But that's all I got for now. Thank you again to the sponsor of today's video, HelloFresh. Be sure to check out their offer for 10 free meals and a free breakfast for life in the description below. It's a great way to test it out, see if it's right for you, and get some solid meals along the way. Thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.